For most of the last 3 weeks, I haven't felt very good. We went on vacation, and my wife, my son already weren't feeling very good, and then I started not feeling very good, and we ended up having to change our plans. Fortunately, because we had a couple weeks off, we could still do the travel up to northern Maine where my family lives. But we had to push everything back. We had to change our plans. And then no sooner did we get back than we got sick again. You know, we weren't even really completely over the first one, and we got hit again. Not to worry, I'm in the clear now, I think, but just dealing with some seasonal allergies now. So it's, one thing after another, but I really can't complain. There will be another day. It's much harder for people who have serious, long-term, chronic illnesses or something going wrong with their bodies that they don't know what it is. Maybe even the doctors don't know what it is, or they're facing serious surgeries, one thing after another. We know people who are in and have been in those situations. Maybe some of you are facing that situation now. When I came to Green in 2014, there was a middle-aged man in the congregation who spent almost the entire year in the hospital due to a sudden event and the complications that led out from it. Sometimes in life, things just hit us, and we don't know why. And so, one of the things we're going to ask today is when we're in this situation, when we're sick, when we're hurt, when our bodies aren't working right. And I'm not talking about, like I say, a virus. I'm not talking about aging, although I've heard many times from many people that that's not fun either. But those are things that are common. I'm talking about situations where something uncommon is happening to you. And it's extremely challenging. Do we ask in those situations, why me? Have I been singled out for some reason for this trial? Why is this happening now? What did I do to deserve this? When we think about our lives and the choices we make, I've noted before that if you do surveys on life outcomes, generally the people who are making choices in keeping with the things that God calls us to do, those people have better outcomes. They tend to live longer, they tend to be healthier, they tend to have better relationships, all of these things. But that doesn't always happen. It's not a rule. It doesn't happen in every circumstance. It doesn't even happen for every person, at least not in this life. And so that leaves us open to those questions. If we're someone that, in spite of our faithfulness, is suffering, it's natural to ask, how can I deal with this? How can I process this? And so we're going to ask, how should we respond when we or our loved ones are suffering? How should we respond when there seems to be no obvious reason for this trial? At the start of Job chapter 2, it says, "One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, 'Where have you come from?' Satan answered the Lord, 'From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason.'" This passage is almost verbatim to a passage in chapter 1. We saw a similar scene there. The difference is that there was already something that happened as a result of that first scene. Job ended up losing all of his possessions. He was well off, and he was rendered destitute. and then his children also perished. But in spite of that, we saw Job was faithful. Job continued to worship God in spite of the losses that he had suffered. And so now we see a reset of the scene. Once again, this figure, and as I said the first time we looked at Job, although this translation renders it Satan, there's actually a definite article here. It's the Satan, the accuser. And so we shouldn't necessarily think about this as telling us something about the relationship between God and the devil. It's rather, this character is a plot device to sort of set up what's going on with Job, to set up how we understand this question about God's justice and God's wisdom in ruling the world. But the addition here at the end is that there's this sort of judgment that Job has passed the test that was set for him in chapter 1. And at another level, this was also a test for God and God's own policies. Recall that basically what this figure, the accuser, is questioning is, first of all, whether the reason that Job is acting out of the fear of the Lord, the reason Job is acting faithfully to God, is that he's getting benefits for it. That it's a tit for tat. It's self-interest. And so the idea was the only way to test this is you take away the benefits, and is he still faithful? But behind this, there's this other question about whether it would be good policy, as we might feel like it would be, for God to just always reward good conduct and always punish bad conduct across the board in every way at every time. And of course we know from experience this is not what happens, at least not in immediate circumstances. But if that were to happen, would that be a good idea? Or would people just say, oh, hey, I'm going to do what God wants me to do because it's good for me? I don't really care about whether it's good in itself or whether it's what God wants. It's good for me. And again, that's not a bad motivation, but if that's our only motivation, we should try to press deeper. So the end of verse 3, God says, he, Job, still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. This affirms again that Job's fear of God obviously wasn't just for the rewards. You take away the rewards, God still worships. Notice here that God also assumes responsibility for what happens to Job, at least in a global kind of sense. That God is taking responsibility for the way that he's running the world. Now we might ask, what about the particular circumstances? Are there other agents, as there seem to be, who are responsible as well? But in terms of the overall way that God is ruling the world, God allowing this to happen to Job somehow fits within God's overall design for the world. And yet it's for no reason. That doesn't mean that God didn't have a reason for allowing it. He did. What it means is that there wasn't a reason in Job's conduct for God to punish him in this way. That in spite of Job's faithfulness, because Job is affirmed even by God himself in chapter 1 as blameless and upright, that is, living in an ethical way. Not sinless, not perfect, but living in an ethical way that's recognized as well. Then Satan answered the Lord. So this is the contention. After God says, hey, Job passed the test. Then Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin. We actually don't know what this phrase means. It's some kind of one of those figures of speech that they're from a long time ago. But basically it means people will they'll do what they can to save their own skin. Skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, he is in your power, only spare his life. Now, he has to spare his life, otherwise in this case the test doesn't have any meaning. We can't test whether Job continues to be faithful if he's dead. So there's a distinction in the two levels of the test that's happening, both for Job and for God. The first test is the removal of the rewards for righteousness, his prosperity, his offspring. And in the second chapter, it's an act, instead of just removing benefits, it's actually inflicting harm on Job himself. He's going to suffer in spite of his righteousness. And the Satan, the accuser's contention here is that even after chapter 1, even after Job has had his rewards for righteousness removed, he could still be worshiping God just out of fear that otherwise God will harm him. And so the only way to test this is to inflict suffering on Job, because this will truly put to the test his integrity and God's policy. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself and sat down among the ashes. Now, there isn't enough information here to know exactly what Job's medical condition is, but the reference to these sores or boils reminds us of one of the plagues that was visited on the Egyptians when Pharaoh wouldn't release the Hebrews from slavery. And it's clear in this circumstance, and will be more clear going on, that Job is miserable as the ashes, which might mean that he's on the city's trash dump, that he's actually an outcast because of his affliction. There's some question about that, because people will come to see him later, we'll see, and whether that would be possible. But in any case, he's miserable, he's in terrible circumstance, and he's not in a situation anyone would want to be in. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." Now, this is the first and the only scene in which Job's wife appears, and different people at different times have sort of viewed her position in different ways. Obviously what she's recommending to Job does not seem like good counsel, and as we'll see more about that in a second. But her point is basically that Job has been faithful to God. He's lost everything. He's suffering. What good has it done him to serve God? And so she tells him to curse God and die. Now, this may seem really, does she even love him, right? What is she doing? But it may be that she's saying, maybe that she's having a hard time watching him suffer. And saying, this is getting him nowhere. If he curses God, God may strike him dead and it may be over. Now, this is really bad advice anyway. By the way, the New Testament said in Hebrews, it's appointed once to humankind to die, and after this comes judgment. If you curse God right before you meet God, that might not be the best thing to do, right? If you do anything to take your life right before you meet God, that may not be advisable either, right? This is not good counsel. But it may be born out of compassion for him. And yet it's misguided, because basically she's telling him to fail the test. They don't know about the test, right? But if he does what she tells him to do, he's going to do exactly what the accuser, what the Satan said he was going to do. But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not say, "I don't think that all women are foolish." That wouldn't be something that we could observe as true. But he is saying that in this particular instance, she's acting foolishly, which is to say, not in the way of wisdom, not in the way that is fruitful. And Job expresses a willingness to tolerate, not just to celebrate when life is good, but to tolerate misfortune and to trust God in the midst of it. That's what Job's response shows, is trust in God, that God, as we sang about, still has good plans. If it's not good, he's not finished yet. right? Job chooses the course of patient endurance to say, I will see this out. I will continue on the path that I believe is right because I believe that at the end, God's faithfulness will be made known in my life. In the book of James, Job is seen as an example of this sort of patient endurance. So now Job has passed both tests. Yet, as we'll see, and as becomes occasion for the lion's share of the exploration in the book of Job, his suffering continues. It's not that, as soon as he says this, it's all over, right? There will be a longer period here. And we can ask, it's not just that he passes the test on day one, right? When you're in a situation like this, you may have days where you say, oh yeah, I'm going to see it through, I'm going to be faithful, and other days where it's tempting to just throw up your hands and say, is this even worth it? So will Job continue in this? And then the question behind it, what does his suffering, or suffering like his, say about the justice of how God rules the world? And this is going to be a topic that's going to be explored throughout the book of Job, so we'll have more time to dig into it. It's going to be a topic in particular that Job explores in conversation with some of his friends, who we now meet in the final passage in chapter 2. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. Men, Bildad does seem to be the shortest person in the Bible. We know that because he was a Shuhite. Okay. The Eliphaz is from Teman, which is a location in Edom. We do know where that is, and it's a place that has in Jeremiah is associated with wisdom. So the picture may be that these are 3 men who would have been expected to be known for their wisdom. And so they're natural sort of conversation partners for Job. There's kind of a parallel, and we might think actually even of the opening of the Gospel of Matthew, that here 3 wise men are traveling to see Job. And they're coming to comfort him, to console him. They have good intentions for what they're coming for. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Now, there's differences of opinion about what's going on here with the friends. It's possible here that the friends at this point are acting in a way consistent with true friendship, that they recognize that Job is suffering. They're willing to sit with him in silence, not to judge him from the outset or assume that it's his fault he's fallen into these circumstances. Maybe they're thinking that, as we'll see later. But at this moment, they're offering him a ministry of presence. They're there with him in his suffering. And they're willing to be with him, to listen to him, to care for him. Now, this contrast is sometimes pointed to because it's really only when they open their mouths that they are shown to be sort of unkind and unfair to his situation, although they have trouble understanding what could be going on in his situation. But the other possibility is that, when they see him, they may judge him at that point. And that these 7 days of silence, and that they may be saying Job is as good as dead because of what's come upon him, and we're grieving for him. So we return to our question that we started from. When we think about this passage and what's going on in this passage, Job's afflictions, his sufferings, both in chapter 1 But then also in chapter 2, what's happening to him is for no reason. That is, it's not punishment for anything or an attempt to correct Job's behavior in any way. It's not discipline, it's not punishment. It's for no reason in that sense. And if we or ones we love are in what seems to be a similar situation, where we look at what they're going through and they say, they don't deserve this. They've been living in a way, they've been striving to live in a way that's faithful to Christ. They've been living in a way that's honoring God's desire for them. None of us are perfect, but in the main, right? Why is this happening? When it appears that it doesn't make sense in that way, are we tempted at that moment, or do we resist the temptation to say, forget it, God. If this was what it's going to be like to follow you, I can do better on my own. Or whatever it is, right? We may say, no, of course not. We wouldn't do that. But a lot of people have chosen this path. A lot of people have chosen the path to say, if this is what it's going to be like to follow God, I am out. Or do we choose the path that Job chooses in this moment? The path of patient endurance. To say, I'm suffering, I don't understand it, but I'm going to continue to walk with Christ. Because He's faithful to all His promises and He will see me through in the end. That the only hope I have is the hope I can find in Him. What other hope can the world offer me? The Apostle Paul reflects on this and much else in Romans chapter 8. And I think this passage, I'm picking out a few bits of it to kind of show you the strand of how this is similar to what we're talking about here in Job. Paul says in Romans 8:18 and following, and some of the verses following, he says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth us. And then he says a little later, for in hope we were saved. If we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to His purpose. So first of all, Paul says, hey, there are sufferings in this life. Paul's suffering. He's got this thorn in the flesh. He's being persecuted for his faith almost everywhere he goes. And yet he's saying, he says elsewhere in 2 Corinthians, this is light and momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory that's ahead. There's no comparing. This seems like it's overwhelming, but it's not anything in the balance compared to the glory that God has in store for us. And we have this hope, he says, but we can't see it. We're not there yet. And yet we have to have this trust that even in this, even in the trial, God is working out of this. God is the one who out of the greatest evil can bring the salvation of the world. Out of the crucifixion of the innocent Son of God can bring the salvation of the world. So in the midst of our travails too, can God not bring a goodness that we cannot recognize now, but we can trust Him to see us through. Now, Paul may, when he talks about the sufferings at the beginning, he may be thinking primarily of his persecution, but he also talks in this passage about the whole world groaning in its bondage to decay, which invites reflection on other things like aging and sickness and other kinds of hardship as well. Of Job's friends at the end, when we're not the ones suffering ourselves, but we're seeking to come alongside and help someone who's suffering, are we willing to sit with them in silence? Are we willing to be present? Some people are just drawn. Some people have a gift. They're just drawn to people who are suffering and they want to help. Other people are like, I don't know what to do, right? I'm going to say the wrong thing. And they're afraid even to show up for someone else. Are we willing to be there for those who are suffering, to sit with them in silence, to listen to them, to pray for them? Sometimes we might think that the best thing we can do is offer them wisdom, give them an answer, try to explain to them what their situation really means. Well, we're going to see in coming weeks that when Job's friends try to do this, they don't do such a good job of it. It's very easy, even as Christians, to offer well-meaning sounding answers that really don't touch the person's experience. We should also remember that Scripture affirms that in the midst of our trials, God is present with us. He's present for us, even when we suffer. That our suffering isn't a sign that we have been abandoned or forsaken by God. In this passage we looked at earlier in Romans 8, just a couple minutes ago, one of the verses in the midst there is about the Spirit helping us in our weakness. The Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. The Spirit that dwells within and among us when we suffer cries out on our behalf, intercedes for us, just as Jesus intercedes for us before the Father. And this presence of God with us, when we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do, we should remember that God is with us, for us, acting for our benefit. And God will bring all things together for good for those who love Him in the end. Hebrews 13 says, He has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, do to me. This is something to hold on to in these moments. To remember, we can trust God. What other hope do we have? He has always been and will always be faithful to see us through in the end. Let's pray.